The wind howled, bone-dry and biting, carrying grit that whipped against the skin like tiny needles. It was the kind of wind that only exists in God-forsaken places, places where the cracked earth seems to scream for rain that never comes. And right there, on a dirt road that looked more like an open scar across the wasteland, an elderly woman was shoved out of a pickup truck. Martha was 70 years old. Every single one of those years was carved into her face by deep wrinkles that told stories of back-breaking labor, blistering sun, and sleepless nights nursing sick kids. She wore simple clothes, the kind of stark black dress that country widows wear out of deep respect for the dead. In her hands, she clutched a small, battered leather suitcase. Just as worn out as she was, holding everything they had allowed her to take, she fell. Not with some dramatic violence, but with the agonizing slowness of someone whose legs simply had no fight left in them. Her knees hit the hard-packed dirt, kicking up a small cloud of dust that instantly vanished into the wind. The suitcase slipped from her grip and tumbled a few feet away. Laughter, echoing from inside the cab of the truck. Three voices, tangled together, celebrating something that had absolutely no right being celebrated. And then a male voice, booming loud enough to cut through the howling wind. A voice dripping with cruel sarcasm and sick, morbid pleasure. "Enjoy your inheritance, Mom." It was Marcus, the eldest. 45 years old, wearing an expensive tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place in that dead wasteland. "Let's see if you can survive the Dust Bowl." More laughter. The engine roared, making the massive truck peel out with unnecessary, violent force. The heavy tires kicked up a massive cloud of dirt that completely swallowed Martha, making her violently cough, coating her black mourning clothes in a thick layer of brown dust. The roar of the engine gradually faded until it completely vanished over the horizon, leaving behind nothing but the howling wind. Martha stayed right there on her knees, caked in dust. Her hands violently shook as she raised them toward the sky. Hot tears carved clean tracks through the grime coating her face. Her lips moved in a silent, desperate prayer, whispering words that only she and God could hear. Words bleeding from the absolute bottom of a shattered soul, but one that still stubbornly refused to completely give up. All around her, as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but pure desolation. Bone-dry earth, baked and cracked by the unforgiving Texas sun. Dead brush, the twisted skeletons of plants that had once been green. And right there, a few yards ahead, a rusted metal sign staked into the dirt. The lettering was faded by time, but it was still legible. Santa Fe Ranch. But to understand how we got here, to truly grasp the absolute sickening cruelty of this situation, we need to rewind the clock. We need to meet this family before the toxic rot of greed destroyed them completely. A week ago, everything still seemed normal. Or at least that specific brand of broken normal that dysfunctional families learn to fake so well. Arthur had passed away 3 months prior. A massive, sudden heart attack that took him right in the middle of his shift at the local hardware store he managed in town. 72 years of a life totally surrendered to hard work, to his family, and to dreams he never had the time to fully chase down. Arthur had been a humble man. Born dirt poor, raised dirt poor. He had been busting his back since he was 7 years old, taking any odd job he could scavenge. He met Martha when he was 20, married her a year later, and together they built a life that, if not rich in dollars, was overflowing with dignity and relentless grit. They had 3 kids: Marcus, the firstborn, Paul, the middle child, and Christine, the baby of the family. Arthur worked double shifts to put them all through school. He racked up overtime, sacrificed weekends and sleep, and aged decades before his time just so his kids could have the hand he was never dealt. College degrees, real careers, a solid future. And they pulled it off. They graduated, climbed the corporate ladder, and landed 6-figure jobs in the city. They married into money and built incredibly comfortable lives. But Arthur had a dream he'd kept locked in his chest since he was a little boy working as a day laborer on other men's cattle ranches. He wanted his own piece of land. He didn't care about the acreage, he didn't care about the soil quality. He just wanted a patch of dirt with his name on the deed, where he could plant, raise a few head of cattle, and live by the rhythm of the nature he always worshipped but was never allowed to own. He spent decades scraping pennies together. Every single spare dollar was dumped into a savings account that grew with the agonizing slowness of terrible interest rates and blue-collar paychecks. Martha backed his play, even knowing that dream demanded brutal sacrifices. It meant never replacing the dying refrigerator, buying clothes from thrift stores, and totally writing off the vacations or tiny luxuries that normal people took for granted. And finally, at 65 years old, Arthur bought his land. The Santa Fe Ranch. 200 acres in a brutal, arid stretch of the West Texas Badlands, where rain was a myth and the ground was as hard as concrete. It wasn't the lush paradise he had imagined, but it was his. His signature on the dotted line. His legacy. The kids were absolutely horrified. Marcus was the loudest. "Dad, have you lost your damn mind? You blew your life savings on a worthless patch of dirt? A dust bowl that's never going to turn a dime?" Paul nodded along, more cautious but just as resentful. Christine simply laughed in his face, calling her father a senile old fool who had just flushed the family's inheritance down the drain. But Arthur didn't give a damn. He and Martha drove out to the property every single weekend. He drafted blueprints, sketched out fence lines, and dreamt of drilling deep water wells and planting orchards that only existed in his mind's eye. Martha saw him genuinely happy for the first time in decades, and for her, that was worth every single penny. Then came the Widowmaker heart attack. Sudden, lethal, lights out. Arthur collapsed in the middle of aisle 4, surrounded by total strangers, miles away from the land he loved and the wife who had given him her best years. The ER doc swore it was instant, that he didn't suffer. Martha was never quite sure if that brought her peace or just made the nightmare infinitely worse. The will was executed a week after the funeral. The estate lawyer, an old friend who had known Arthur for years, unsealed the folder with solemn hands. The modest house in the suburbs, where Martha lived, was left to her as a life estate. The savings account, thin, but there, would be split evenly between her and the 3 kids after she passed. But the Santa Fe Ranch was left entirely to Martha, armed with an ironclad clause. It could only be sold with her explicit signature, and the kids were only entitled to a tiny fraction of a percentage of the sale if she ever chose to pull the trigger. The detonation was instant. Marcus slammed his fist on the mahogany table so hard the legal files jumped. "This is absolute garbage. That wasteland isn't worth a dime, and she gets to sit on it while we walk away with basically nothing?" "Marcus, please don't talk like that," Martha begged, her voice paper thin from days of crying. "Your father wanted me to have the ranch. It was his life's dream. His dream left us practically bankrupt." Christine shrieked, her voice pitching up with toxic entitlement. "Do you have any idea what we could have done with the cash he set on fire buying that cursed dirt? And now we don't even get a cut." Paul didn't say a word, but his silence was total compliance. He had always been the spineless one, the guy who just drifted with the current, totally incapable of growing a backbone when his older siblings started shouting. The following days were a pressure cooker. The kids started dropping by Martha's house constantly, but not out of grief or love. They came to break her down, to bully her into putting the ranch on the market, trying to force a pen into her hand to sign pre-drafted contracts with bottom-feeding buyers they had lined up. "Mom, you're 70 years old," Marcus would argue, using that sickeningly condescending tone that faked genuine concern. "What the hell are you going to do with a ranch in the middle of nowhere? You can barely keep up with the vacuuming here, let alone manage 200 acres. Just sell it, Mom," Christine would push. "At least that way we can salvage something out of this pathetic excuse for an inheritance." But Martha held her ground, not because she actually wanted to become a rancher, but because it was her husband's final wish. It was the only physical piece of the man she had loved for a half-century left on this earth. Selling the Santa Fe Ranch felt like spitting on his grave, and she absolutely refused to do it. The kids' frustration quickly mutated into rage. The rage mutated into deep toxic resentment, and that resentment inevitably festered into something vastly darker. It was Marcus who engineered the play. One night, huddled together in his upscale living room, the 3 siblings were mapping out their options. "She is never going to sell," Christine sneered, sipping a $100 Cabernet from a crystal glass. "She's too damn stubborn. She's going to die clutching that piece of paper." "Then maybe that's exactly what needs to happen," Marcus said slowly, the heavy sinister implication hanging in the air. Paul stared at his brother, the blood completely draining from his face. "You aren't seriously suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting we put a gun to her head," Marcus quickly backpedaled, lowering his voice. "But think about it. Mom is old. She's fragile. If something were to happen naturally, say she had a terrible accident, or just vanished out there, after a reasonable waiting period she'd be declared legally dead. and then the entire estate defaults to us. 100%. That is insane, Paul whispered, but his voice was already trembling with cowardice. It's survival, Christine corrected him, her eyes dead and cold. We played by the rules our whole lives. We deserve a hell of a lot better than the pathetic scraps of a squandered inheritance. They drafted the blueprint over the next few days. They would manipulate Martha into visiting the ranch, pitching it as a tribute to Dad's memory to get her guard down. They'd drive her out there, deep into the Badlands, miles from the nearest highway or cell tower, and they would just drive away. No water, no food, zero chance of hiking out. Mother Nature would do the dirty work, and they would keep their hands legally clean. Paul tried to push back. This is murder. You guys get that this is literal first-degree murder, right? But Marcus and Christine crushed him. They weaponized his massive gambling debts. They reminded him of the crushing pressure he was under while their father burned cash on useless dirt. And eventually, like the coward he was, Paul caved. That is exactly how, on a blistering Thursday morning, the three siblings pulled up to Martha's driveway, flashing fake, loving smiles and a sickeningly sweet invitation. Mom, we were talking. We really think you should see the Santa Fe Ranch. Go stand on the dirt that meant so much to Dad. We want to take you out there. Martha, deeply moved by what she believed was finally a breakthrough with her kids, agreed on the spot. She packed a small leather bag with a change of clothes and a few priceless keepsakes, and she climbed into the back of that heavy-duty pickup truck, completely unaware that she was buckling herself into death row. The drive took 3 grueling hours. They left the city limits, trading 4-lane highways for cracked asphalt, then for gravel, and finally for dirt trails that were barely on the map. Martha tried to make small talk, but her kids shot back one-word answers, their jaws tight. And when they finally hit that dead-end dirt road, when Marcus slammed the truck into park and turned around with that sickening predatory grin, she knew. She knew way too late. The trip had started at dawn. 6 a.m. on a cloudless Thursday, the sun already threatening a brutal, scorching heat. Marcus laid on the horn twice outside Martha's house, impatient, acting like he was doing a massive favor he barely had the schedule for. Martha hurried out, her beat-up leather bag slapping against her leg, her chest swelling with a fragile, naive hope she had no business carrying. She thought, as she pulled herself into the high cab of the truck, that maybe this was a reset button. That finally, her children had realized how much the Santa Fe Ranch meant to their father, how that scorched earth symbolized a lifetime of sweat. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally ready to forgive her for backing his crazy dream. But the illusion started cracking before they even cleared the city limits. Martha tried to break the ice, her soft voice fighting against the suffocating heavy silence filling the cab. It's so sweet of you kids to drive me out here. I really wanted to see the land, but I just couldn't make the drive alone. Yeah, Mom, Christine cut in from the back seat, her tone dripping with a venom that Martha desperately tried to write off as morning fatigue. You really can't manage much of anything on your own these days, can you? Marcus chuckled, a short, totally humorless sound. Paul, riding shotgun next to Martha, just stared blankly out the passenger window, his jaw clenched so hard the muscle popped, his fists white-knuckled on his thighs. Martha noticed, but she didn't connect the dots. She just figured he was stressed about being away from the office. The hours dragged on in escalating silence. The scenery morphed from concrete to rural farmland, from lush green to burnt yellow, from civilization into a purgatory of suspended death. The pavement surrendered to packed dirt. The dirt surrendered to deep, violently rutted trails that tossed the heavy truck around, violently throwing Martha side to side until her brittle bones ached. How much further? She asked, her voice shrinking. We're here, Marcus announced, and there was a dark, terminal finality in his tone that made Martha's stomach violently drop. Something was terribly wrong. Something permanent. He threw the truck into park in the middle of that abandoned, desolate trail. There was absolutely nothing in sight. Just cracked earth, dead mesquite bushes, and that howling wind that sounded like screaming ghosts. Marcus twisted around in the driver's seat, and the smile plastered across his face was pure, unadulterated evil. All right, Mom. Welcome to your inheritance. That was the exact second Martha understood. When she saw that psycho grin, when she heard Christine giggling in the back, when Paul still absolutely refused to make eye contact. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together, and the terror that paralyzed her lungs was absolute. Kids, what are you doing? Exactly what you forced us to do. Marcus fired back, throwing his door open. He marched around, ripped Martha's door open, and yanked her out by the arm with brutal force. You chose this cursed dirt over your own flesh and blood, so now you get to keep it. Permanently. Martha stumbled, crashing to her knees on the hard-packed dirt. Her bag was chucked out right next to her, kicking up a cloud of dust. She tried to push herself up, but her legs had turned to jelly. The shock was paralyzing. "Please," she begged, raising her trembling hands toward them. "Please don't do this to me. I'm your mother. I carried you, I raised you, I fed you, and you chained us to a pathetic blue-collar life," Christine spat, not even bothering to step out of the AC. "Enjoy your empire, old lady. Let's see how many hours you last." "Enjoy the inheritance, Mom," Marcus shouted, slamming his door shut. "Let's see if you can survive the Dust Bowl." Their sick laughter was drowned out by the roar of the massive V8 engine. The truck peeled out violently, the heavy rear tires kicking up a massive smokescreen of dust that completely swallowed Martha alive. She coughed, choking on the dirt, throwing her hands over her face, but it was useless. The grit coated her eyes, filled her mouth, and burned her lungs. And then, dead silence. The engine faded into the distance. Only the wind remained. Only that crushing, absolute isolation that felt physically heavy, pinning her against the dirt. Martha stayed right there, on her knees, caked in grime, and wept. She cried with an agony that bypassed physical pain. Her own babies, the infants she had nursed, the toddlers she had rocked through nightmares, the teenagers she had pushed toward success. They had just driven away and left her to rot in the sun. Nightfall in the Badlands hits fast and hard. The sun, so merciless all day, vanished without warning, sucking every ounce of heat out of the atmosphere. The temperature plummeted at a terrifying speed. Martha had never felt a cold like this. Bone-dry, razor-sharp, slicing right through her skin and forcing her muscles into violent, uncontrollable spasms. She unzipped her bag with violently shaking hands, not from fear, but from hypothermia and clinical shock. Inside were 3 changes of clothes, a small rosary Arthur had bought her decades ago, a yellowed wedding photo, and a plastic water bottle. It was only half full, because she had assumed it was a quick day trip, that there would be a well at the ranch, that they'd be back in town for dinner. Martha layered every single piece of clothing she had, one over the other. She was still shivering violently. She curled into a fetal position on the hard ground, using the leather bag as a pillow, hugging her knees to her chest to trap a body heat that was rapidly fading. The sky above was a blanket of stars, more stars than she had ever seen through the city smog. They were breathtaking, sickeningly beautiful for a scene this horrifying. She prayed. She whispered the entire rosary, the beads clicking between her arthritic, freezing fingers. Every Hail Mary a desperate plea for a strength she didn't have, for a rescue she knew wasn't coming. "Lord," she whispered into the infinite black void, "if I'm meant to die in this dirt, please make it fast. But if there is any reason for this, any purpose at all, give me the grit. That's all. Just the grit to survive one more sunrise." Dawn dragged the sadistic sun right back up. Martha woke up feeling like she had been beaten with a bat, every joint screaming, her mouth so completely bone-dry her tongue felt like sandpaper. She allowed herself one tiny sip of water, strictly rationing it, knowing she had to stretch it as long as possible. But stretch it for what? To die tomorrow instead of today? She scanned the horizon. Nothing. Nobody. That dirt trail hadn't seen tire tracks in years before yesterday. Nobody was driving out here. Nobody was going to stumble across her. If she wanted to cheat death, she had to move. But move where? North, south, east, west. It was all an identical infinite wasteland. Then her eyes caught it. On the blurry horizon, a deep depression in the terrain. Something that looked exactly like a dried-up stock tank. Water, she thought. A jolt of desperate adrenaline hitting her system. There might be groundwater in the basin. She grabbed her bag, her muscles shrieking in protest, and started walking. It took 2 brutal hours. The sun baked her skin, and precious sweat she couldn't afford to lose stung her eyes. Her feet, wearing nothing but cheap, worn-out sandals, were bleeding from ruptured blisters. But she kept pushing, because the only other option was lying down to die. And something deep inside her, stubbornness, faith, or maybe just a primal refusal to give her sociopathic kids the win, absolutely forbade her from quitting. The reservoir was dead, bone dry. The cracked mud at the bottom formed jagged, geometric patterns that seemed to openly mock her. Martha collapsed to her knees on the edge of the crater and sobbed. It was just too much. It was the final nail in the coffin. But then she noticed a detail. Dead center in the basin, right where the deepest point used to be, the dirt was a slightly darker shade of brown. Damp, maybe. Running on the very last fumes in her tank, Martha scrambled down the steep, rocky embankment. She slipped, tumbled, and tore the skin off her knees and elbows. But she didn't stop. She hit the center and started digging, barehanded. Her fingernails snapped, the skin on her palms shredded, blood mixing directly into the dirt. But she clawed at the ground like a trapped animal. And miraculously, impossibly, she hit moisture. It wasn't a puddle, but it was heavy, wet mud. With violently shaking hands, Martha ripped the cotton scarf off her neck. She scooped a handful of the wet mud, packed it into the fabric, and twisted the makeshift filter directly over her cracked, open mouth. Drops fell. Muddy, filthy water that tasted like dirt and copper. But it was liquid. And in that exact second, it was pure life. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, in a city with paved roads and central AC, 3 people were celebrating. The steakhouse was elite, the kind of spot that serves tiny portions on massive white plates, where a single bottle of Cabernet costs more than Martha took home in an entire month. Marcus hoisted his wine glass, the dark red liquid catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. "To our new portfolio," he toasted, a massive, greedy grin splitting his face, "which should be clearing probate very soon." Christine clinked her glass against his, giggling. "That old bat won't last 72 hours out there. The Badlands don't take prisoners. She's probably coyote food by now." She took a deep, luxurious sip of the wine, savoring not just the vintage, but the taste of total victory. Paul didn't touch his glass. He just stared blankly at his $150 ribeye, his stomach violently churning with a sickening, paralyzing guilt. He tried to speak, opened his mouth, but his throat locked up. Marcus clocked it and slapped him hard on the back. "Chill out, bro. It was a necessary evil. And besides, we didn't technically commit a crime. We just gave her exactly what she wanted, Dad's precious real estate." He laughed at his own sick joke. "Is this pure evil making your blood boil? Hit the like button right now to prove you demand absolute justice for this abandoned mother." That night, while her 3 kids slept in $1,000 mattresses wrapped in Egyptian cotton, Martha was curled up on the jagged rocks of a dead reservoir, death gripping her leather bag, shivering so violently her teeth chipped, her stomach cramping from vicious starvation, her lips split and bleeding from dehydration, her body battered and bruised, but alive, defying every single odd, actively sabotaging her children's murderous plot. She was still breathing. And as she stared up at the endless Texas sky, Martha whispered, not a prayer of surrender, but a blood oath. "I am going to survive this. I am going to survive this if only to look you in the eyes and prove you failed." The following days blurred into a hallucinatory nightmare of pure agony and survival. Martha completely lost track of time. The sun would explode over the horizon, bake her alive, vanish, and the freezing night would tag in to torture her. She guessed it had been 3, maybe 4 days since they dumped her. Every single one felt like a decade in hell. She kept walking, not because she had a destination, but because sitting still meant waving the white flag. Her feet were constantly bleeding now, the useless sandals tossed miles back because they were doing more damage than good. The bottled water ran out on day 2, and since then she was surviving strictly on the filthy drops she squeezed from mud whenever she found a low spot. Starvation was a physical predator, a dull, throbbing pain that started in her gut and radiated out to her fingertips. She tried chewing on mesquite leaves, but she violently threw them back up. Her system was too far gone, her stomach completely rejecting anything that wasn't liquid. It was on what she believed was day 5 that she spotted it, warping through the heat waves on the horizon. Something geometric, something that wasn't rocks or dead trees. It wasn't a mirage, her gut knew it. It was a structure. Walls, the jagged remains of a collapsed roof. Ruins, the old ranch house. It had to be. Martha's legs, which had been operating purely on muscle memory, found a hidden reserve of adrenaline. She picked up her pace, stumbling, eating dirt, dragging herself back up. The leather bag felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but she absolutely refused to drop it. It was her only anchor to reality, the only proof she was a human being, and not just a ghost dying in the desert. The ruins were larger than they looked from a distance. The skeleton of a homestead that had once been modest but proud. Collapsed adobe walls returning to the dust. A tin roof completely shredded by decades of wind, exposing massive holes to the sky. But it offered shade. For the first time in 5 days, there was real shade. Martha collapsed across the threshold and just laid face down in the dirt. Her biological engine had completely seized. She closed her eyes, 100% certain she would never open them again. And a part of her was totally at peace with the end. She had fought, she had bled. But flesh and bone can only take so much punishment. But she woke up. Hours later, as the brutal sun finally started dipping below the horizon, her eyes snapped open. And the very first thing she saw, as her vision adjusted to the shadows, was a well. Tucked into the corner of the ruined homestead was a circular stone structure. A deep water well. Martha literally army crawled over to it. She peered over the stone edge, and her heart instantly flatlined. Dry. Totally dead. Just a pile of rocks at the bottom, choked with spiderwebs and 50 years of dust. She wanted to scream, but she had absolutely no tears left to cry. The desert had already stolen all her water. That was when she noticed, in the opposite corner of the ruined yard, the faint outlines of an old garden. Stone borders, patches of darker soil that proved things had actually grown here once upon a time. It was a graveyard now, obviously. Just the brittle, bleached bones of crops that lost the war against the sun. Martha sat right there in the middle of the dead garden and automatically reached into the deep pocket of her black dress. Her fingers brushed against something tiny and dry. Seeds. She had packed them before leaving her house, wrapped in a scrap of tissue paper. Sunflower seeds. She had planned to plant them at the ranch to honor Arthur, who had always loved them. She stared at the seeds in her palm, stared at the dead dirt. And something inside her, something that completely bypassed human logic, made a call. If she was going to die in this dirt, she wasn't going out on her back. She was going to die trying to bring something to life. With strength she didn't know she possessed, Martha got to work. She found an aggressively rusted hoe leaning against a crumbling wall. The wooden handle was dry-rotted, but the heavy iron blade held. She started hacking at the dead soil, breaking the crust. She used her absolute last drop of water, the muddy liquid she had squeezed into a broken clay shard she'd found, to moisten the dirt. She planted the seeds, one by one, her hands violently shaking. She whispered a prayer into the dirt over every single one, and then she collapsed again, her battery officially at 0. The fever hit that night. It started as a violent shiver, then rapidly mutated into a blistering, boiling heat that plunged Martha into severe delirium. She saw shadows detaching from the ruined walls. She heard voices whispering her name in the howling wind. And then she saw him, Arthur, standing right in the doorway of the ruins, looking exactly like he did the day he died. He didn't look like a see-through ghost. He looked completely solid, so real that Martha weakly reached her hand out to him. "Arthur, did you come to take me home?" He smiled, that warm, anchor-like smile she had leaned on for 50 years. "Not yet, Martha. Your clock hasn't run out yet." His voice echoed weirdly, like it was broadcasting from a mile away but also right inside her skull. "You have to find it first." "Find what?" Martha tried to push herself up, but her muscles were paralyzed. "Arthur, I'm so tired. I'm just so tired." "I know, sweetheart, but the gold was always right here." He pointed a calloused finger to a very specific corner of the ruined floor, where the flagstones looked slightly uneven. "You were only ever going to find it when the well ran dry. It had to happen this way." "I don't understand." "You will." He started fading, his flannel shirt blurring into the moonlight. "Dig, Martha. Dig exactly where I'm pointing. That's why you survived the walk. That's why you're still breathing." Martha woke up to the sun blazing high in the sky. The fever had broken, leaving her totally hollowed out but incredibly clear-headed. It took her a few minutes to process the dream. Or was it a hallucination? Arthur, the ruins, the specific corner he had pointed at. It was clinical insanity. It had to be. Dehydration dreams don't hand out treasure maps, especially not to starving old women. But at the exact same time, what the hell else did she have left? What else was on the schedule besides waiting for her heart to stop? Martha dragged her broken body over to the corner from the dream. The flagstones right there actually were misaligned, forming a jagged, unnatural pattern compared to the rest of the floor. Gripping the rusted hoe with hands that could barely make a fist, she started hacking at the floor. The ground was like concrete. Decades of baking heat had basically forged it into solid rock. Every strike of the iron blade sent a violent, shocking pain up Martha's arms, making her shoulders scream. But she didn't stop. Strike after strike, ripping deeper into the dirt, and then the blade struck something that wasn't rock. A hollow, solid thud. Ceramic, maybe. Martha dropped the tool and started clawing the dirt out with her bare hands, completely ignoring the pain, ignoring her fingernails tearing off, ignoring the blood dripping onto the dry earth. She unearthed a heavy clay jar, large, sealed shut with thick ancient wax that was severely cracked. Martha hauled it out of the hole with a massive grunting effort. It was heavy. Not gold bar heavy, but packed tight with something dense. With violently shaking fingers, she chipped the brittle wax seal away. She pried the heavy lid off and looked inside. There were no diamonds. There were no stacks of cash. It was packed with paper, thick yellow documents meticulously rolled up and preserved against the elements. Martha pulled them out with absolute reverence, unrolling them onto the dirt floor in front of her. The first was a deed, ancient, dated decades back. She read it slowly, her blurry eyes fighting to focus on the fine print. It was the master deed to the Santa Fe Ranch, but an original chain of title, way older than the papers Arthur had signed, back when the property was held under a different name. And right there, buried in an addendum written in faded black ink, was something explosive. Mineral rights. The deed guaranteed 100% unsevered ownership of absolutely any mineral discovered beneath the soil. Signed, sealed, legally bulletproof. Martha grabbed the second document. It was a map. Hand-drawn, instantly recognizable as Arthur's work. She knew his precise mechanical drafting style anywhere. The map plotted out the entire 200 acres, loaded with highly specific topographical markers, subterranean aquifers, bedrock formations, and several areas circled with a chemical symbol she didn't instantly recognize. There was a heavy note scrawled in the margins in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. Martha, if you are reading this, I'm already gone. Please forgive me for hiding this, but I was terrified it was a wild goose chase. I had the soil core drilled before I bought the land. There is lithium here, a massive vein of it. I didn't have the capital or the time to tap into it, but it's sitting right under the dirt. Our golden ticket was always right here, buried where nobody bothered to look. The Badlands keep their secrets. I love you forever. Arthur. Martha read the note 3 times, 4, 5. The ink didn't magically change. Lithium. Arthur bought this dead patch of earth knowing there was a massive lithium deposit, the most aggressively hunted high-value mineral of the century. The absolute backbone of modern batteries and tech. A literal gold mine buried directly under her bleeding feet. She looked around the collapsed ruins, at the dead, scorched wasteland stretching out to the horizon, at the unforgiving blue sky, and she started laughing. It wasn't a joyful, celebratory laugh. It was dark, raw, absolute irony. Her psychopathic kids had driven her out to the middle of nowhere to die, specifically so they could steal an inheritance they thought was totally worthless. And that worthless dirt was sitting on millions, tens of millions, and they would never see a dime. Because she was going to live. She was going to survive out of pure, spiteful grit, a refusal to die, and a burning need to rip their victory away from them. And the absolute second she walked out of this desert, she was going to make them bleed for every single drop of agony they put her through. Martha's laughter echoed through the ruins, bleeding into the howling wind, carving a lethal promise into the universe. Martha sat paralyzed in the dirt, surrounded by the scattered documents while the sun continued its brutal march across the sky. But she didn't feel the blistering heat anymore. She didn't feel the agonizing thirst or the starvation that had been ripping her apart for days. She just felt a deep, chilling numbness as the reality of what she had dug up set in. She pulled another folded paper from the jar. This one was crisp, dated only 6 months prior to Arthur's fatal heart attack. It was a formal corporate letterhead from a massive firm called Apex Global Mining and Hydrology, addressed directly to Arthur. Dear Mr. Miller, the letter began in slick corporate legalese. Following our preliminary geological surveys, we would like to formally present our offer to acquire the exclusive mineral and subterranean water rights to your property, the Santa Fe Ranch. Martha kept reading, her hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. The corporate letter broke down how deep core sonar had confirmed 2 massive jackpots hiding under the dead dirt. First, a colossal subterranean aquifer, millions of gallons of pure, filtered groundwater, enough to sustain a commercial bottling operation or supply a municipality. Second, and vastly more lucrative, a sprawling high-yield lithium deposit. The buyout number was buried in the final paragraph. Martha read the digits, then reread them. She was absolutely certain she was hallucinating from the heat. But the ink was solid. $15 million for a 100% buyout. Or alternatively, a partnership where Arthur kept the deed but surrendered operational control for a 20% royalty cut, projected to yield tens of millions over a 20-year contract. $15 million. Martha's brain literally couldn't process a number that heavy. It was a level of wealth she couldn't even conceptualize. More cash than she had ever seen in a movie. More money than her arrogant corporate kids would earn in 10 lifetimes of climbing the ladder. There was another letter, this one dated 3 months before Arthur died. It was a carbon copy of his reply to the mining conglomerate, typed out with the careful, deliberate keystrokes Martha remembered him using on his old typewriter. To the board of directors, Arthur wrote, I am deeply humbled and surprised by your highly generous offer. However, I require time to deliberate. This acreage represents far more than a financial asset to me. It is a lifelong dream realized. Furthermore, I must consult my wife, Martha, as any decision carrying this magnitude must be made as a united front. I am formally requesting a 6-month window to review my options. Martha crushed the letter against her chest, the tears finally breaking through the severe dehydration. He wanted to talk to her, even staring down the barrel of instant generational wealth. Arthur wanted to wait, wanted to sit at the kitchen table with her, wanted them to pull the trigger together. But then the Widowmaker hit. Sudden, lethal, lights out. And he died before they could ever sit down at that table. He died taking the $15 million secret to the grave, desperately trying to protect it until he could do it right. There was one final document rolled up at the bottom of the jar. A will. Not the boilerplate legal document read by the estate lawyer in the stuffy office, but something raw and personal. A holographic, handwritten will drafted by Arthur just 2 months before his heart stopped. My dearest Martha, she read, her cracked voice whispering the words into the dead air, as if speaking them aloud made the ghost real. If you're reading this, it means my clock ran out, and you found the jar I had John, our old neighbor, bury for me. Please forgive me for keeping the true value of this dirt a secret. It wasn't because I didn't trust you. It was because I was terrified of what the kids would do. Martha stopped, gasping for air, her brain trying to process the heavy hit. She forced herself to keep reading. Our children, Martha, have morphed into people I don't even recognize anymore. Marcus with his endless, cutthroat greed. Christine with her toxic disgust for anyone she views as beneath her tax bracket. Paul, who is too much of a coward to ever stand up to them. I am terrified of what they would do if they found out about the lithium, about the aquifer, about the millions sitting under this dust. I am terrified they would put a target on your back just to get their hands on the payout faster. Martha's tears were free-falling now, splashing onto the brittle paper. Arthur knew. He had always known exactly what kind of predators they had raised. Because of that, the letter continued, I am leaving 100% of the estate in your name. The deed, the mineral rights, the final call. You have always been vastly wiser than me, tougher than me, more righteous than me. I trust you to make the absolute right play, whether that's taking the buyout and living like a queen, leasing the land to create jobs, or just telling the suits to go to hell so you can watch the sunsets in peace. Whatever trigger you pull will be the right one, because it will be driven by the pure heart I spent my whole life admiring. The clause in the official will says, so that she may dictate the legacy of our Santa Fe for a very specific reason. Because you are the boss, Martha. Not me, not the kids, you. As for our children, I legally had to leave them a microscopic fraction of the sale price just to prevent them from contesting the will in probate court. But the nuclear keys, the final authority, is entirely yours. Aim it well. I love you more than the English language can properly explain, and even from the other side I will be standing right behind you, cheering for you, watching your six. The Badlands keep their secrets, my love, and the biggest secret is this. You were always infinitely tougher than you thought. Yours until the end of the line, Arthur. Martha folded the letter with extreme care, her hands shaking, not from weakness this time, but from pure, unadulterated adrenaline. She looked around the collapsed ruins, at the cracked earth stretching to the horizon, at the blinding blue sky. And she didn't celebrate. She didn't feel a rush of euphoria over becoming a multimillionaire. She just felt a crushing, suffocating grief, because Arthur was dead right. The children she had carried, the babies she had nursed, the teenagers she had bankrupted herself to send to college, had mutated into absolute monsters. Psychopaths who were totally willing to drive their own mother into the desert and leave her to rot, just to speed up the probate process on an estate they thought was worthless. They didn't even wait, she whispered to the howling wind. They didn't even wait to see if I'd sell the property. They didn't try to negotiate or compromise or just wait me out. They just tossed me out here to die. And the brutal, sickening irony of the whole nightmare hit her like a sledgehammer. If they had just waited, if they had treated her with a fraction of human decency, if they had just pretended to be a loving family, she would have inevitably sold the land and split the massive payout with them. $15 million chopped 4 ways was still generational wealth that would have permanently altered their lives. But they couldn't wait. They didn't have the patience. Their toxic greed and sociopathic entitlement completely overpowered any shred of love, any drop of decency, any microscopic trace of humanity they had left. Martha meticulously gathered all the documents, the original deed, Arthur's hand-drawn map, the corporate buyout letters, the holographic will. She loaded everything back into the clay jar and hugged it fiercely to her chest like a newborn baby. "You trusted me, Arthur," she said to the sky, to wherever he was watching from. "You trusted me to drop the hammer, and I will. I swear on my life, I'm going to drop the hammer." She stared at the small garden plot where she had buried the sunflower seeds. The dirt was still a dark brown from where she had sacrificed her last drops of muddy water. It was totally insane, she knew. Those seeds had a 0% chance of germinating in this oven. But Arthur always said that real faith was planting the seed even when the meteorologist promised a drought. "I'm going to survive," she swore, not entirely sure if she was talking to herself, to God, or to her husband's ghost. "I'm walking out of here, and when I cross that county line, I am bringing hell with me, not out of petty revenge, but because you 3 need a brutal lesson in cause and effect. And I'm going to be the professor." The sun began its violent descent, setting the sky on fire in bleeding shades of crimson and burnt orange. Martha laid down on the dirt floor of the ruins, spooning the clay jar. And for the very first time since she was pushed out of that truck, she felt something vastly more powerful than despair. She felt absolute, cold-blooded determination, total purpose, and a tiny, brilliant spark of something that looked a hell of a lot like hope. She didn't know the logistics yet, but she was going to beat the Reaper. She was walking out of this wasteland, and when she hit the pavement, the entire world, especially 3 highly specific executives, were going to find out they had massively miscalculated the bite of an old woman they treated like roadkill. The Badlands kept their secrets, and the most lethal one was just waking up. 3 weeks had burned away since Martha was dumped on that dirt road. 3 weeks that, for her, felt like crawling through a century of razor wire. But for her kids, it was 3 weeks of nervous, popping champagne celebration, aggressively waiting for the phone call that would officially clear the board. It was Paul who cracked first. The guilt, which started as a tiny, ignorable knot in his gut, had metastasized into a suffocating cancer that kept him awake at 3 a.m., unable to eat, unable to look in the mirror without seeing a murderer staring back. On a Sunday morning, his hands violently shaking, he grabbed a burner phone and dialed the local sheriff's department. "There's an elderly woman abandoned out at the old Santa Fe ranch. Coordinates are..." He hung up before the dispatcher could trace the ping, but the domino had been tipped. When the cruisers rolled up to Marcus's gated mansion 2 days later, armed with warrants for elder abuse and reckless endangerment, blind panic swept through the siblings. But Marcus, always the sociopathic chess player, always the slickest liar in the room, had his script fully memorized. "It was just a memorial trip, officers," he explained to the detectives with the icy confidence of a guy who bought his way out of DUIs. "We drove Mom out to see Dad's property. She wanted to walk the fence line to take some pictures, and when we got back to the truck, she was gone. We combed the brush for hours, but it's hundreds of acres. We were literally on our way to the station to file a missing persons report, but we've just been in total clinical shock." It was a lie. A sickening, bulletproof lie. But there were 0 witnesses and absolutely no physical evidence, and the 3 of them had elite defense attorneys on speed dial, who easily spun the narrative into a tragic, plausible accident. They were released without charges after 48 hours. But the magistrate stamped a mandatory condition on their release. They had to ride back out to the ranch with the search and rescue teams to point out the exact timeline. Marcus viewed it as a massive win. They'd ride out, confirm the old bat was a skeleton, because nobody survives 3 weeks in that oven. and they could finally fast-track the death certificate and liquidate the estate. The convoy rolled out on a blistering Tuesday morning. 2 sheriff's SUVs, Marcus's blacked-out Raptor carrying the siblings, and a heavy-duty search and rescue rig. The drive took 4 brutal hours over deeply rutted, punishing terrain. When they finally breached the property line, the sight waiting for them made the entire convoy slam on their brakes in absolute paralyzing disbelief. The homestead. The collapsed, ruined adobe homestead that was supposed to be a pile of rubble was operational. Not a luxury villa, but highly fortified. The tin roof had been professionally patched. The crumbling walls were braced. There was even a heavy-duty canopy set up on the porch, shadowing a rocking chair where someone was currently sitting. Someone wearing a stark black dress. Someone with bright gray hair. Someone who was supposed to be a pile of bleached bones in the dirt. Martha. Marcus stomped the brake pedal so aggressively the heavy truck violently fishtailed in the dirt. Christine let out a high-pitched, strangled noise that was half scream, half dry heave. Paul just buried his face in his hands and started violently sobbing. Martha didn't even get out of the rocking chair. She just watched them through the dust cloud with a terrifyingly calm, stone-cold expression as the doors opened and the cops piled out in total confusion. Standing directly behind her rocking chair were 2 men in sharp suits, a younger guy clutching a leather briefcase, and an older guy wearing wire-rimmed glasses. The 3 siblings stepped out of the truck in slow motion, trapped in a waking nightmare. Marcus was the first to reboot his sociopathic hard drive, plastering on that fake $1 million smile he used to close hostile takeovers. "Mom!" He jogged toward the porch, throwing his arms wide open in a sickening display of fake relief. "Thank God, you're alive. We were losing our minds. We brought the cavalry to bring you home." Martha didn't flinch. She just stared at him with eyes that saw straight through his tailored suit, straight through his lies, right down to his rotting core. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't yelling, but it carried a sub-zero chill that made the armed deputies take a step back. "You came to bring me home?" She let the question hang in the dead, hot air for a painful second. "Or did you come to collect the inheritance?" Marcus froze dead in his tracks. The fake smile shattered. "Mom, I have no idea what you're talking about." "Shut your mouth." The command slashed the air like a bullwhip. Martha stood up from the chair, and for the very first time, her kids realized she wasn't a fragile, broken old lady anymore. She was gaunt, yes, severely weathered by the sun, but she radiated an absolute lethal power that hadn't been there a month ago. "I survived. I beat the grave you dug for me. And while I was surviving, I did a little reading." She gestured to the younger suit, who popped the latches on his briefcase and pulled out a stack of heavy legal folders. "This is Mr. Henderson, my attorney, and this is Mr. Miller, the Regional VP of Apex Global Mining and Hydrology. They drove out here because they have some breaking news that affects your bottom line." Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his corporate voice echoing clearly across the dirt. "Martha has just officially executed a binding contract transferring the exclusive mineral and subterranean hydrology rights of the Santa Fe Ranch. The cash buyout for the transaction was exactly $50 million. The silence that fell over the yard was absolute. 50 million. The number was too massive to process. Christine was the first to verbally malfunction. 50 million? Her voice was a pathetic, strangled squeak. "This dirt is worth 50 million? "It was," Martha corrected her. "Now it's my 50 million. And according to your father's ironclad will, validated by the state courts and Mr. Henderson here, I am the sole, undisputed proprietor. By law, you 3 were entitled to a pathetic 5% cut of the sale if I ever pulled the trigger. But your father included a very specific safety protocol." She pulled a folded document from the attorney's hand and read it loud enough for the deputies to hear. "The heirs shall only inherit their percentage if they maintain a standard of respect and care for the widow during the grieving period. In the event of documented abuse, neglect, or abandonment, all rights to the estate are instantly and permanently revoked." Martha folded the paper and locked eyes with her creditors. "You drove me into the Badlands and left me to die. The sheriff has the anonymous tip. They have the geolocation data, and I have my sworn testimony, 3 weeks of absolute hell that almost killed me. Therefore, your inheritance is officially 0. Marcus lost his mind. "That is absolute garbage. You cannot legally—" "I can, and I just did." Martha stepped off the porch, marching straight up to him, and Marcus instinctively backed away like a whipped dog. "You dumped me out here to bake in the sun. You clinked wine glasses while you imagined the coyotes eating my remains. And you did it all for a payday you didn't even know existed. Christine collapsed to her knees in the dirt, sobbing hysterically. But they were tears of pure financial devastation, not an ounce of actual remorse. "Mom, please! We made a massive mistake! We can go to counseling, we can fix this!" "A mistake?" Martha's voice boomed, echoing off the rusted ruins. "Forgetting a birthday is a mistake. Scuffing a bumper is a mistake. You premeditated my murder. You conspired to leave me to rot. That isn't a mistake, Christine. It is pure distilled evil." Paul, who had been completely paralyzed against the truck, finally broke. He dropped to his knees, totally different from his sister. His tears actually looked authentic. "Mom, I was the one who called it in. I tipped off the cops. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't live with what we did. Please, God, forgive me. I know I belong in hell, but please." Martha stared down at him for a long, heavy minute. And for the very first time, the titanium in her eyes softened just a fraction. "Paul, you made the call. It was way too late, but you made it. And because of that one phone call, I am not pressing attempted murder charges against you like I am against your siblings. But forgive you? Cut you a check? Absolutely not. You had the chance to step up and be a man, and you chose to be a coward. Now you get to live with the tab." She pivoted to face all three of them, her voice dropping back into that lethal sub-zero calm. "Real family doesn't leave you to die in the Badlands. You are not my blood anymore. Now get the hell off my property. And if I ever see a single one of your faces again, my security team will have you arrested for trespassing." Marcus tried to scream, threaten lawsuits, and negotiate a settlement. Christine begged, hyperventilated, and swore she was a changed woman. Paul just hauled himself up from the dirt and quietly climbed back into the truck, completely broken. And slowly, under the hard stares of the armed deputies who now completely understood the monster they were dealing with, the three siblings drove away. Martha watched them retreat, the dust cloud from the Raptor fading into the brutal horizon. And only then did she allow her knees to buckle. Mr. Henderson caught her arm, gently guiding her back into the rocking chair. "You made the absolute right call, Martha," the lawyer said softly. "I know," Martha replied, her voice heavy with the exhaustion of 100 years. "But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt like hell. Now I'm asking you, was she right to cut them all off? Or did Paul, who actually tried to repent, deserve a second chance? Sound off in the comments below. 5 years burned away. The Santa Fe Ranch was completely reborn. The subterranean aquifer was being tapped with strict ecological protocols, pumping premium, purified mineral water to 3 different states. The lithium mining was highly regulated, operating on a low-impact grid. And Martha collected a monthly royalty check that defied human logic. But she didn't build a mega mansion. She didn't buy a fleet of exotic cars. She didn't do a single thing her arrogant kids would have done. Where the crumbling adobe ruins used to sit, a beautiful, sprawling, single-story compound had been built. Lush green courtyards and heavy shade trees thrived in the desert heat, fueled by the endless groundwater. And right there, on the dirt that was supposed to be her graveyard, operated the Arthur Miller Sanctuary, a premium, fully funded sanctuary for abandoned and abused seniors. There were 32 full-time residents, men and women who, just like Martha, had been thrown away like garbage by the families who were supposed to protect them. Out here, they had private suites, 5-star meals, 24/7 medical staff, and above all else, bulletproof dignity. Martha was sitting in the courtyard on a warm Saturday afternoon, resting on a cedar bench underneath a massive towering sunflower, grown directly from the exact seeds she had buried in the dirt on her deathbed. All around her, dozens of elderly residents were playing cards, laughing loudly, simply existing without an ounce of fear or isolation. In her hands, she held a photograph. A young Arthur, flashing that rugged protective smile she missed every single day. She rubbed her thumb over his face, whispering into the Texas breeze, "You called it, old man. The jackpot wasn't the lithium. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the bank accounts. The real gold was having the grit to plant a seed when the whole world swore it wouldn't rain. It was surviving not to become a monster, but to make sure nobody else ever had to bleed like I did." One of the residents, Mr. Harrison, shuffled over. "Martha, the kitchen says the steaks are almost ready. You coming inside?" She smiled, sliding the photograph safely into her pocket. "I'll be right there, Mr. Harrison. Just catching up with my Arthur. I guarantee he's looking down right now, incredibly proud of the empire you built," the old man said with a warm grin. "I hope so," Martha replied, pushing herself up from the bench. "God, I hope so." And as she walked toward the massive dining hall, surrounded by dozens of people who loved her strictly for her heart and not her checkbook, Martha knew with absolute certainty that she had pulled the right trigger. The Badlands keep their secrets, and she had unearthed the greatest one of all. True wealth was never buried in the dirt. It was forged in the hearts of those who refused to let a vicious world turn them vicious. Did this brutal story of survival and ultimate justice hit you right in the chest? Then smash that subscribe button and hit the bell for more intense, dark stories that prove that even in absolute hell, true grit and a righteous heart can turn a graveyard into an oasis.